Thank you. It's wonderful to be here this morning, and Natalie and Diana and I seem to be wandering around Boston as a threesome these days. Every time we turn around, we seem to be in the same place doing much the same thing. So it's great fun being with Natalie and Diana today. An observant visitor arriving at the monastery guest house on Memorial Drive in Cambridge will notice two items prominently displayed in the lobby. One is a framed image of a fashionably dressed woman in a wasp-waisted outfit, wearing a string of pearls around her waist. She is standing in front of a piece of fabric and appears to have a halo behind her. At the bottom is a fragment of a handwritten document. On another wall is a green marble plaque with a Latin inscription. Both these items are related to one another, but unless you know something about the woman in the picture, something about the Society of St. John the Evangelist, as well as something about 19th century Boston, you may not understand the significance of these pieces and why they are there. The wasp-waisted, bejeweled woman in the portrait is, of course, Isabella Stewart Gardner, or Mrs. Jack, as she was often referred to in life. The original portrait, now hanging in Mrs. Gardner's museum, is the famous and at the time slightly scandalous portrayal of her done by John Singer Sargent and completed in 1888. The document at the bottom is a portion of a document which sets out one of her wishes in her own handwriting. In the building occupied by the museum in the chapel at the end of the long gallery, on the 14th of April each year, a memorial service shall be conducted by the Cowley brothers. Her will further states that, I direct that on my birthday in every year, that the trustees shall have a memorial service conducted by the Society of St. John the Evangelist, otherwise known as the Cowley Fathers, in the chapel at the end of the long gallery, in the building occupied by the museum established under this will. On the wall nearest where the portrait hangs is a green marble plaque with a Latin text which reads in translation, in pious memory of Isabella Stewart Gardner, 1923, by whose liberality this wing of St. Francis House was built for the greater glory of God, 1925. Over the years, literally thousands of people have walked past these two memorials. Some have perhaps used their high school Latin to puzzle out the text on the marble plaque. Others may have taken a few minutes to examine the portrait and the attached document. Many, if they are not from Boston or familiar with her museum, would be as puzzled as most of us are when we read the various memorial plaques lining the walls of countless churches and cathedrals, wondering who these people might have been. Like those memorials, there is a story behind this pair of memorials in the guest house lobby. So what is that story behind this framed portrait, the plaque, and most of all, the memorial service held each year on Mrs. Gardner's birthday in the chapel at the end of the long gallery? Part of the story can be found in a letter from Father Spence Burton, SSJE, to Mrs. Gardner, dated the 10th of April, 1919. Mrs. Gardner had just made a gift of $25,000 to the society in order to help purchase the Memorial Drive property. Today, by the way, that gift would have been the equivalent of roughly $500,000. In his letter of thanks, Father Spence Burton wrote, "How can we ever thank you adequately for your goodness to us? Only today have I heard of your gift. Land on the river in Harvard neighborhood is scarce and high-priced. With the $25,000 my parents had previously given me, we were able to buy half the lot and secure the option on the rest. Your money, we hope, will buy it. Our hearts are so full of gratitude that we have already offered thanksgivings to God and prayers for you. Our masses and communions tomorrow will be in thanksgiving for your gift and in supplication for God's blessings upon you. We pray that many generations of religious will venerate your memory as a foundress of their monastery and will pray for you as their generous benefactress." A further gift of $250,000, or in today's money, over $4.5 million, was made by Mrs. Gardner to the Society before her death in 1924. This allowed the Society to build the first wing of St. Francis House, now the monastery guest house. Given during her lifetime, the gift came at a time when the Society needed it to begin building St. Francis House, and is perhaps the reason why the Society was not one of the beneficiaries in her will, while, for instance, the Church of the Advent was, receiving $5,000 at her death. It also meant that should her will be contested, the Society would already have received the monies. These were not the first gifts Mrs. Gardner made to the Society, nor was it the beginning of a friendship. Rather, they were simply the latest in a series of many points of contact over several decades. So to understand the friendship between Mrs. Gardner and the Society of St. John the Evangelist, we need to travel back to the beginnings of SSJE in this country. That story begins in 1870, when the Church of the Advent, then located on Bowden Street, on the other side of Beacon Hill, wrote to Father Benson, the superior and one of the original members of the Society of St. John the Evangelist in Oxford, for assistance. Those of you who know your parish history will know that after the death or resignation of its first three rectors, William Croswell, Horatio Southgate, and James Bowles, this parish was again without a rector in 1870. At a meeting of the committee to select a new rector, held in early October 1870, one of the committee members, Richard Dana, the lawyer, politician, abolitionist, and author of 2 Years Before the Mast, suggested that the committee to nominate a rector be authorized to make temporary arrangements with the Reverend Mr. Benson of Oxford to assist the rector ad interim in carrying on the work of the parish. By this time, SSJE, which had been founded in Oxford 4 years earlier, consisted of 11 members, 3 of whom were American citizens. In fact, Dr. Henry Liddon, professor of scripture at Oxford University, is said to have commented that he would not be surprised to see the American eagle placed above the door of the mission house in Oxford. With so many Americans in the society in Oxford in those early days, including Charles Chapman Grafton, about whom we will hear more later, it was the hope and indeed intention that SSJE, as soon as feasible, would open a house in the United States. Father Benson thought this request was so significant that he immediately dropped everything and came to Boston with 2 companions. However, the arrival of SSJE was not greeted with joy either in Puritan Boston or by the Bishop of Massachusetts, Manton Eastburn. One of the Boston newspapers declared that a cable dispatch from England has arrived in this country a few days ago, informing us that no less than 30 members of a new religious order, which had sprung up in the Anglican Church, were on their way to America. The Boston Evening Transcript later somewhat sheepishly admitted that while 30 members had been heralded, only 3 disembarked. Father Richard Muse Benson, Father Simeon Wilberforce O'Neill, and the Reverend Frederick William Puller. The writer described them as ascetics in life who apparently subject themselves to a discipline very similar to that of monks that Catholicism nourishes so numerously on the continent. They hold themselves aloof from the world and do not marry or own personal property. Their dress is after the pattern of that worn by Roman Catholic clergy. The small group was met by Father Oliver Sherman Prescott, another member of the society and an American who had been working in Boston for the previous 3 months. Earlier in his life, Prescott had worked in Maryland, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, and had been involved in the very first attempt to form a religious community within Anglicanism at Valley Cruces, North Carolina, in the 1840s. Prescott had been the 4th member to join the community and was professed in 1870. In many ways, his arrival in Boston that same summer was a return to old haunts, as he had been at one time been an assistant priest at the Church of the Advent, then on Bowden Street, where he had been subject to 4 ecclesiastical trials because of his ritualistic activities. He was acquitted on each occasion. So the scene is set. 3, not 30, arrived in November 1870. The newspaper had gone on to say that the 3 gentlemen were somewhat surprised when they found that they were so numerously heralded, but were willing to pardon the slip of the telegrapher's hand, which unwittingly, no doubt, had multiplied their number by 10. However, not only was the Boston press suspicious of these 3 monks, but the Diocese of Massachusetts was outright hostile. As Father Robert Smith, SSJE, tells us in The Cowley Fathers in America, The Early Years, iciness would be a mild noun to use in describing the manner in which Manton Eastburn, the diocesan bishop, greeted the arrival of the Fathers. He even went so far as to refuse to see them. Much to the embarrassment of the Church of the Advent, who had invited Benson to Boston, Bishop Eastburn would not give him a license to function as a priest. Benson, obedient to episcopal authority, limited himself to offering instructions in the Sunday school room, teaching Bible study classes, and traveling throughout the eastern United States and Canada, where he was warmly received. Back in Boston, it was finally arranged, however, that the Reverend Charles C. Grafton and the Reverend Oliver S. Prescott, members of the society, who as priests of the American Church were canonically eligible, should take active charge of the services of the parish. It seems that the restrictions imposed by Bishop Eastburn on Prescott 20 years earlier had been removed. With this decision, a détente was established between the diocese, the society, and the Church of the Advent, and Father Grafton, himself no stranger to either Boston or the Church of the Advent, set sail for Boston toward the end of 1871. It is probably with the arrival of Grafton at the Church of the Advent that Mrs. Gardner's association, both with the society and with this parish, began. Yet her connection to Grafton precedes that of her connection to the society or the parish by many years. Born in 1830 on a site at the corner of Boston Common, where the Masonic Temple now stands, Charles Chapman Grafton's influence on the lives of many people and in many places was immense. One of those so influenced was Isabella Stewart Gardner, whose husband Jack was a distant cousin of Grafton's. The Graftons and the Gardners had known each other for generations. Originally intending to make law his profession, Grafton soon came to believe that he could do more for humanity by going into the church than into politics. It was as a young law student that Grafton found himself attracted to the Church of the Advent, and at the age of 21 was confirmed, although because of Bishop Eastburn's boycott on the Advent, that took place at St. Stephen's. A clue as to why Grafton may have been attracted to the Church of the Advent can be found in a description of the parish from about this time by Oliver Wendell Holmes, who described the parish as a church with open doors, with seats for all classes and colors alike, a church of zealous worshippers after their faith, of charitable and serviceable men and women, one that took care of its children and never forgot its poor, and whose people were much more occupied with looking out for their own souls than in attacking the faith of their neighbors. In its mode of worship, there was a union of two qualities, taste and refinement, which the educated require just as much in their churches as elsewhere, and the air of stateliness, almost pomp, which impresses the common worshipper and is often not without its effect upon those who think they hold outward form of little value. Writing to her mother at about 1877, after the return of Grafton to the Advent following a time of convalescence, Helen Williams, wife of the Reverend Pelham Williams, then an assistant priest at the Advent, says something similar. I have just come from church, the afternoon service for the Sunday school. Grace, who is her daughter, wanted me to see her walk in with her class. The children are very much interested in everything about the parish. We go to a great many of the services on Sunday and during the week. Father Grafton is to be back from England the 1st of September to take charge of the Advent again. His health is much improved. Along with Grafton, two other members of the society were on the staff at the Church of the Advent at this time. Father Edward William Osborne, then aged 27, and Father Arthur Crawshay Alliston Hall, who was also 27 when he arrived in Boston. It is interesting to note that all three of these men later became bishops of the church. Grafton of Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, Osborne of Springfield, Illinois, and Hall of Vermont. these three men offered an attractive and rich diet for the spiritually hungry Bostonians during this time of spiritual ferment. As Brother Eldridge Pendleton, SSJE, tells us in his biography of Grafton, this was a time when the local cognoscenti of Boston were interested in the contemporary cross-currents of religious thought, whether it was Persian mystical poetry, the teachings of Mary Baker Eddy, or what the Cowley Fathers had to say. Many of those who heard Arthur Hall's lectures, often held in the parlors and drawing rooms of the wealthy and socially prominent members of the Advent, which drew many of their friends, not all of whom were Episcopalians, fell under Hall's sway and were soon attending the Church of the Advent. One of those socially prominent individuals who fell under Hall's sway was Isabella Stewart Gardner. Father Hall was born in 1847, was a graduate of Christ Church, Oxford. He was received as a postulant in the society when he was just 22 years old. Ordained deacon in 1870 and priest the following year, he was sent to Boston in 1874 to assist Grafton. He soon gained a reputation of being an excellent retreat conductor, spiritual director, and preacher. It was to Hall that Mrs. Gardner turned, still grieving the death of her son Jackie 10 years before. The death of her son and other close members had devastated Mrs. Gardner, and nothing, certainly not the travel recommended by her doctors, alleviated her grief. With the arrival of a distant relative in the person of Grafton as rector and Hall as one of his assistants, the Church of the Advent, with the drama of its Anglo-Catholic liturgy, its concern for the poor and marginalized, its socially and racially mixed congregation, as well as the quality of the preaching and music, attracted the Gardners, who, until then, had been members of the more fashionable Emmanuel Church on Newbury Street, and they soon transferred their membership to the Advent. Under the influence of Hall, a subtle shift began to take place in Mrs. Gardner's life. While there is no documentary evidence, community lore suggests that it was that as an antidote to grief, Hall recommended not travel, but service. As her spiritual director, Hall helped deepen her spiritual life and taught her to pray. In addition, he encouraged her to begin visiting the Free Hospital for Women, or the Boston Lying-In Hospital, both now constituent parts of Brigham and Women's Hospital, where she would often sit at night incognito in the rooms of sick or dying women, keeping them company. Her own grief found relief, and over time, she began to find the peace which travel had been unable to provide. The relationship between Mrs. Gardner and Hall was clearly a close one, as letters from Hall held in the archives of the Gardner Museum demonstrate. In them, Mrs. Gardner asks after his health and encourages him to rest. Hall, in turn, asks for money. In one such letter, he tells her of a case to which your alms would be exactly applied. A little girl named Belle Manning, child of a struggling mother in the North End with a drinking father who spends a good deal of his time away, was run over and is in the Massachusetts hospital, Ward 30. Will you see her? During the 6 weeks or so that she is there, the mother loses Belle's wages, 75 cents a week, which will really be a great loss. Would you like to give the money to the child to hand as her wages still? To the mother? Or sent it by us? What is fascinating to note is that Hall not only assumed Mrs. Gardner would indeed make the gift, but that she would take it to the little girl in the hospital herself. As the Church of the Advent attracted more parishioners from both the poorer and largely black neighborhoods of Beacon Hill, as well as from the wealthier and largely white neighborhoods of Boston, the old church on Bowden Street became too small and unsuitable for the congregation. At the same time, a rupture occurred between Father Benson, the superior in England, and the American members of the society in Boston, especially Father Grafton. While this is not the place to go into too many details of that rupture, suffice it to say that it was partially about governance and the failure of the English members of the society, and especially Benson, to follow through with the original intention of establishing a fully autonomous branch of the society here in the United States. The final rupture came in a letter from Benson to Grafton, dated the 4th of July, 1882, in which Benson said, "God forbid that I should hold you down under obligations of past vows of obedience if they have become a burden to conscience." Upon reading this letter to Father Osborne, Grafton said to him, "You will understand, therefore, Father, that I am no longer a member of the Society of St. John the Evangelist." With that, the three American members of the society, Father Grafton, Father Prescott, and Father Walter Russell Gardner, withdrew from the society. Meanwhile, as the break was coming to a head, the new Church of the Advent on Brimmer Street was nearing completion. On Passion Sunday, the 11th of March, 1883, members of the Church of the Advent worshipped for the last time in the old church on Bowden Street. On Thursday of that week, services were held for the first time in the new building on Brimmer Street. On Palm Sunday, the remaining English members of the society, the Sisters of St. Margaret, and the few remaining parishioners celebrated the Eucharist at what was now called the Mission Church of St. John the Evangelist. The vast majority of the Advent's congregation, including, presumably, the Gardners, chose to follow Father Grafton down the hill to Brimmer Street. This was not, however, to be the end of the story about Mrs. Gardner and her association with the Society of St. John the Evangelist. For while she remained a parishioner of the Church of the Advent for the rest of her life, she maintained her friendship with Father Hall and later Father Field, Father Pole, and Father Burton. The year 1890 initiated a number of significant events in the life of the society that had a direct impact on Mrs. Gardner and her association with us. After 24 years as superior, Father Benson stepped down, and in August of that year, Father Robert Lay Page was elected to succeed him. Shortly thereafter, Benson left for Oxford to fulfill a lifelong dream of seeing India. After a journey of well over a year that took him to India, China, Japan, and Canada, he finally arrived in Boston in February 1892. He arrived to a shattered community and a once again decimated congregation on Bowden Street as a result of an event that had a direct impact not only on the society, but on Mrs. Gardner and with her relationship to its members. You can see Father Benson, What have I done? I've done something. You can see this is the only photograph of Father Benson that we have of him in a beard. But there he is. And those are some of the children from the neighborhood. Notice they're all black. Since his arrival in Boston in 1874, Father Hall's reputation as a teacher, preacher, and spiritual guide had grown significantly. An Englishman by birth, he became an American by choice, and was as brilliant as he was handsome. He had a notable ministry to young men, and was a popular preacher at Harvard, Princeton, and Williams, as well as prep schools such as St. Paul's and Groton, where he would frequently join the boys in their games. Among his clerical colleagues, he was equally respected. In 1889, Diocesan Convention elected him as a delegate to General Convention, and the following year he was elected to the Standing Committee. It was, however, his friendship with Dr. Phillips Brooks, the rector of Trinity Church Copley Square, that was to be the stumbling block, at least within the society. In 1888, Hall had traveled to Canada for the consecration of the Reverend Frederick Courtney, the former rector of St. Paul's Church, Boston, as bishop of the Diocese of Nova Scotia. His traveling companion was Dr. Phillips Brooks. Thus began a warm and close friendship between the two men, despite their theological differences. Upon returning to Boston, Brooks commented to a friend, "I saw a good deal of Father Hall, and we had talks together. I like him. Of course, he is radically English. And when he came to explain his ideas upon Holy Communion, he talked in a language I really could not understand." Little did either man know that their friendship would alter Hall's life and his relationship with the society. With the death of Bishop Paddock of this diocese in early 1891, the Diocese of Massachusetts met to elect a successor. For weeks before the election, Boston newspapers were full of articles commenting on the fitness or unfitness of one man for the position, the rector of Trinity Church itself, Phillips Brooks. Some spoke loudly on his behalf. Others condemned him as a Unitarian at heart and disloyal to the doctrines of the Episcopal Church. He was elected on the first ballot by a large majority of both clergy and lay delegates. The ramifications for Father Hall and thus Mrs. Gardner were almost immediate. While the impression with the society back in Oxford was that Hall had indeed voted for Brooks, various accounts in Boston and even from Hall himself stated clearly that he did not. What he did do, as required by canon, was to sign the testimonial affirming the election. For many in the society in Oxford, unfamiliar with the ways in which the Episcopal Church elected bishops, this appeared to mean that Hall approved of what they regarded as Brooks's questionable theology, and therefore his unsuitability to be bishop. Furthermore, Hall's association with Brooks called into question, among some members of the society, Hall's own suitability for leadership. In September of that year, Hall was ordered by the superior to return to Oxford permanently. At a farewell dinner given in Hall's honor, now Bishop Brooks said, "We owe much to the Cowley Fathers for the giving to us of Father Hall, and we will try to forgive them for taking him away." This untwinning of cords so wrapped around our hearts is both the saddest and richest of our experiences. No distance can ever dim our gratitude to him for his long and precious service to Christ and man, nor separate us from the mutual and long-continued trust and love. No doubt similar expressions of sorrow were echoed by Mrs. Gardner for the loss of her friend, confessor, and spiritual guide. The Sunday after Hall's departure for England, there were only 6 people in the congregation of St. John's, Bowden Street. The choir, the various church workers, and all those who had flocked to St. John's under Hall's leadership dispersed en masse. This included 2 priests, though not members of the society, who had worked along with the society for many years. The future Bishop of the Philippines, the Reverend Charles Henry Brent, and the Reverend Henry Martin Torbert. This left the remaining members of the society and very few supporters at the church on Bowden Street. With the crisis in Boston, it was clear that a decision made some months previously had been a good one. Shortly after Father Page's election as superior in 1890, the question of the Society's future in the United States once again came to the fore. At the time, the community was serving at both St. Clement's, Philadelphia, and St. John the Evangelist, Boston. The work in both places, however, was becoming an increasing strain on the Society, and in 1891, it was decided to withdraw from Philadelphia in order to concentrate on the Society's work here in Boston. This had the impact of bringing Father Charles Neil Field, SSJE, to Boston, and into direct contact with Mrs. Gardner, just at the time Father Hall was departing. There are 2 qualities to Father Field's character noted by his friends and acquaintances. His sister once said of him that colored people always won his heart. In the days shortly after his ordination, he had a forlorn little black boy constantly with him, as rather looked down upon by other boys. Father Burton went on to say, "I imagine that Father Field made a friend of the boy because he was looked down upon by the other boys. Anyone in trouble found a friend in dear Father Field." In addition, Burton commented that Father Field converted more people to the faith by his smile than anyone did by a sermon. All of us, Burton said, knew his smile and have been blessed by it. It was Father Field who involved Mrs. Gardner in the work of St. Augustine's Church. In the years before and after the American Civil War, the neighborhoods on and around Beacon Hill were the center of Boston's African American population. The mostly affluent white inhabitants of Beacon Hill's south slope were strongly supportive of abolition. This attitude encouraged free blacks, as well as formerly enslaved people who had managed to escape slavery and find their way to Boston, to move onto the nearby north slope of Beacon Hill. After the Civil War, this area continued to be an important center of African American culture and was one of the few locations in the United States where African Americans had a political voice. At least one black resident of Beacon Hill sat on Boston's Community Council during every year between 1876 and 1895. Situated in the heart of Boston's black community, the Church of the Advent, first located on Merrimack Street, then on the corner of Lowell and Causeway, and finally on Green Street, before settling on Bowden Street, was a natural spiritual home for the black community, especially since it was one of the few Episcopal churches that did not charge pew rents, and where black parishioners were not confined to the gallery. During this time, the parish register of the Advent shows that several black children, as well as adults, were baptized there. With the move to the more affluent and white side of Beacon Hill, this work was inherited by the Church of St. John the Evangelist. You can see, those of you who are parishioners here at the Advent, this is the Church of the Advent on Green Street before the move to Bowden Street. In 1886, Hall could report that we have probably in past years in the Church of the Advent and in our mission church of St. John the Evangelist, Bowden Street, ministered to a larger number of colored people than any other Episcopal parish in Boston or in the state. This was the work into which Father Field plunged himself when he arrived in Boston in 1891, and into which he sought Mrs. Gardner's support. Originally begun as St. Philip's Mission, named after the disciple in the Acts of the Apostles who baptized the Ethiopian eunuch, by the St. John's Guild of the Church of the Advent, then under the direction of Father Osborne, a Sunday school and later a trade school on Cambridge Street was opened in 1882. Over the years, a coffee house on Charles Street was established, until finally a storefront on Anderson Street was rented. From there, the congregation moved to a former Methodist church further down Anderson Street, where the Bishop of Massachusetts, for the first time, conducted a confirmation for a black congregation in a black church in 1886. Soon after this church too proved to be too small, and on Epiphany 1892, the newly built Church of St. Augustine on Phillip Street was opened. It was there that the ordination of the first black priest in the Diocese of Massachusetts, the Reverend Oscar Lieber Mitchell, took place in 1894. Through the generosity of Mrs. Gardner, who made a gift of $12,000, or nearly $500,000 in today's money, towards the building, and the determination of Father Field, all of this was made possible. Because of Mrs. Gardner's gift, the new St. Augustine's Church was opened debt-free, and through her involvement, Mrs. Gardner contributed yet again, not only to the work and ministry of the Society, but to the history of Boston's black community. Her support is further illustrated by her anonymous birthday gift of $1,900 to Father Field in 1899, which enabled the Society to purchase a farm in Foxborough, Massachusetts, and establish St. Augustine's Farm for Colored Children. Today, that would have been the equivalent of about $75,000. And here you can see Father Field at St. Augustine's Farm with some of the children. It was there that Field took the children of St. Augustine's Church, and after 1904, from the relocated Church of St. Augustine and St. Martin on Lenox Street, for the summers. Many of these children, once summer holidays began, would have been left alone during the day while their parents worked. Field's solution was the farm, later called Camp St. Augustine, where the children of the parish could be cared for and given a holiday out of the city. This gift of Mrs. Gardner's continued in existence for over 100 years until it was finally closed in 2002. Mrs. Gardner's friendship with Father Field is further illustrated by a letter from Brother Gilbert Tompkins to Father Page, then the superior of the Society in England, from the 1890s. Brother Gilbert described working late into the evening with Field and Mrs. Gardner one Holy Saturday, preparing the Church of St. John the Evangelist for the celebration of Easter the next day. In that letter, he describes the three of them hanging a new reredos behind the high altar upon which three angels had been stenciled. It's kind of hard to see them, but they're there. And how at the end of the task, the three looked at it with complete satisfaction. Mrs. Gardner may have remained loyal to the Church of the Advent, to Father Grafton, and later to Father Hall, but that did not mean she broke off with other members of the Society. Father Frederick Cecil Pole holds the honor of being the last member of the Society to be Mrs. Gardner's confessor and spiritual director. Born in England in 1864, he was 20 when he emigrated to Canada, planning to study engineering. Plans change, as they often do, and he prepared for the priesthood instead, and was ordained in Toronto in 1891. A chance encounter with Father Benson in 1892 resulted in his coming to the Society in Boston to test his vocation 2 years later. As was our custom at the time, he was sent to Oxford for his novitiate, where he was professed, and in 1898 sent to our house in Cape Town, South Africa for 2 years. In 1900, he was transferred to Boston, where he spent the rest of his life. While Hall excelled in being able to minister to men, among Pole's great gifts was his ability to minister to women. Father Pole's letters may strike today's readers as cloying, sweet, or overly sentimental. However, they struck a chord with their recipients. The combination of sentimentality and flattery seems to have been the ticket for his popularity, including with Mrs. Gardner, who appears not to have been above a certain amount of flattery herself. In various letters, Pole assured Mrs. Gardner, "You have kept what so many lose as they grow up, simplicity and simplicity and vision. We get wise with so many details called facts, and we lose the great view. You know, no, you do not know how much I love you. Do not allow yourself to think your soul is not prospering." As her friend, spiritual director, and confessor, it was Pole who brought Mrs. Gardner Holy Communion and heard her confession every other week as she lay more or less incapacitated during the last years of her life. And that is where our story concludes. Not with her life, but in her death. Far removed from the world of privilege that Mrs. Gardner had known all her life, she came face to face with Sister Death, as St. Francis, the little poor man of Assisi, once called death. The brittle pages of the Mission House diary found in the archives at the monastery, written by Father Burton in order to exchange news between members of the Society living away from Boston, contain an almost day-by-day account of her decline and death, until now known only to her family and members of the Society of St. John the Evangelist. I will let those who were there speak for themselves. November 1922. For all her semi-paralyzed state and 87 years, Mrs. John L. Gardner, Queen Isabella of Boston, is full of indomitable courage and kindness. Twice this week she has come to St. Anne's Convent on Temple Street, and on Tuesday she drove all the way out to St. John's House, Arlington Heights. Sunday after Christmas, 1922. Children of the church go to Fenway Court to sing carols for Mrs. Gardner, who is now quite unable to get to church, having to be carried from carriage to couch or easy chair. April 1923. Early this morning, a telephone message from Fenway Court to say that Isabella Gardner was failing and wished for her communion at once, if possible. Mrs. Gardner was conscious and was able to follow the prayers. Very possibly she may be dying. It is characteristic of her that she insisted on having the priest before the doctor. The attendants think that she did too much and allowed herself to be wheeled about too industriously some 10 days ago when there was an exhibition in the house. The flowers in her courtyard are magnificent. Epiphany 1924. The children of St. John's House sang carols to Mrs. Gardner this morning, as they have done for a number of years at Christmas time. She is confined very much to her room and is bravely holding her own. That same month, the Blessed Sacrament was carried to Mrs. John L. Gardner, Fenway Court. July 9th. Mrs. Gardner has had a serious heart attack and is not expected to live. Father Pohl communicated her on Tuesday morning, and he has been there each day since. I went there this evening and sat for a long time on the roof with Mrs. Gardner's niece, Mrs. George Monks. Sister Winifred is one of the nurses taking care of Mrs. Gardner. The next day, I had to leave St. Augustine's farm directly after lunch to come to town in time to see Mrs. Gardner before she got settled for the night. I found Mrs. Gardner very weak but audible, courageous, merry, affectionate, and devout. There is no one quite like her. She is better today, and I think she may survive this attack as she has at other times, although neither her physicians nor Father Pohl think she will do so. July 14th, 1924. When I reached Fenway Court just before noon, I found Father Pohl leaving there. He did not see Mrs. Gardner as she was still unconscious. I remained a few minutes to speak with her niece, Mrs. Monks. Just then, Mrs. Gardner had a collapse. We all gathered around her bed and offered what we thought were the prayers for her good death. By the time the doctor had arrived, she had rallied a little, but even then I thought she might die any moment, and at the most would not live through the night without regaining consciousness. Later that afternoon, she regained consciousness, had Father Pohl hear her confession, and prepared her for communion next morning. 2 days later. Early this morning, the George Gardners telephoned me that Mrs. Gardner had gained consciousness again and would I come. They sent their car for me, and within a few minutes I was back at her bedside. We had some prayers together, and although she made no responses, I am sure that she was conscious that we were all there and entered spiritually into the prayers. It is pathetic that she cannot die. God may be giving her her purgatory now. When I am with anyone who takes a long time to die, I can only pray, O God, make speed to save us. O Lord, make haste to help us. July 18th, 1924. Mrs. Gardner died late last night. God rest her soul. Her niece, Mrs. Monks, telephoned early this morning to give us the news and to ask me to be at Fenway Court at 10 for prayers with the family. They sent a motor for us, and Father Field and I went. Mrs. Gardner's body lay on a low bier, covered with a purple pall, before the altar in the Spanish chapel. Candles in great candlesticks burned at the four corners of the bier, and by it were two prie-dieu, on which the sisters of St. Margaret and of St. Anne kept vigil day and night, as long as her body lay there. This was all done according to Mrs. Gardner's explicit directions. It was very characteristic of her to have planned every detail of her funeral. When I'm at the museum and I'm standing at the Spanish chapel, I can't help but imagine this scene. At the foot of the steps of the Spanish gallery, separated from the chapel by the wrought iron grille, were other prie-dieu and chairs for relations and friends to sit and kneel. All the arrangements were dignified and beautiful, graceful and majestic. We certainly have lost a great friend and Boston its most distinguished citizen. I gave her her last blessing Thursday noon. Dr. Van Allen, the rector of the Church of the Advent, called this morning to ask us to assist at her funeral. Although Mrs. Gardner has worshipped at St. John's, Bowden Street, much more than at the Advent during many years past, she always remained a parishioner of the Advent. By Dr. Van Allen's request, Father Pohl and I said the requiems for her at Fenway Court, assisted him at the funeral at the Church of the Advent, and I said a requiem there for her also, and went with him to the cemetery. Father Pohl returned from Nantucket this afternoon. He has cared for her faithfully as a priest during these last years of her illness. The next day, at 9:30 this morning, I said a requiem for Mrs. Gardner in the Spanish chapel in the presence of the body. Brother Dale and Brother Edward served me, and Brother Dale assisted with the chalice. Shanna, here's a line for you. We used the magnificent Cellini chalice. Only the sisters, servants, and immediate family were present at the requiem this morning. It was extraordinarily simple and touching in the midst of all that beauty and magnificence. This has been a hard day, but we have cause for rejoicing in that Mrs. Gardner died in a state of grace, fortified by the sacraments. July 21st. Father Pohl said a requiem at Fenway Court at 9:30 this morning. Brother Dale and Brother Edward served him as they had me, and the children from St. John's House, Arlington Heights, were present to sing a few hymns. Latterly, they have gone to Mrs. Gardner's both at Christmas and Easter to sing carols for her. It was lovely having them there this morning to sing at her requiem. By Dr. Van Allen's request, I said a requiem for her at the Advent at 11 o'clock. Father Pohl and I were there in choir for the funeral at 12, and I read the lesson. The music was beautiful and the church crowded. Her great-nephew, the Reverend Gardner Monks, who has just been ordered deacon this spring, was also with us in the sanctuary and read the opening sentences at the cemetery. It is difficult for me to believe that Mrs. Gardner has gone from our midst. I have never known Boston without her. A year later, April the 14th, Easter Tuesday, 1925. After early masses elsewhere, we got to Fenway Court in time for Mass there at 9. Father Pohl, who had been Mrs. Gardner's priest here, was the celebrant. We sang the Missa de Angelus with the propers of the Mass in plainsong. It was, of course, unaccompanied. The long gallery at Fenway Court, with its beautiful chapel at the end of it, was glorious with the spring sunshine coming through the great 13th century French glass. The congregation was composed only of the trustees of the museum and members of the Gardner family. It was a privilege to offer the Holy Sacrifice there for Mrs. Gardner. It could not be a requiem this year, for her birthday came this year in Easter week. We had a festal Mass of Easter with special prayers for her soul. The Mass had to be over by 10 o'clock, for the museum opens up at that hour. Things don't change. Although it was a payday, the trustees asked all of us to wander about the house as we pleased, an unusual privilege. In fact, one of the trustees took us into rooms that are not open to the public. A year later, at 9:30 o'clock this morning on a radiant, sunshiny spring day, we offered our annual Mass in the Gallery Chapel at Fenway Court. Father Pohl was the celebrant. The congregation was composed of about 25 members of the Gardner family and intimate friends of Mrs. Gardner. 6 of the Sisters of St. Anne were also invited guests. The solemn Mass of Requiem, sung unaccompanied, was impressive and beautiful. I think everyone present was deeply appreciative of it. After the service, we are free to wander about the house as we pleased. I wish I could have stayed there all morning, but I had to attend other duties. At noon, Mr. Carter, custodian of Fenway Court, and Mr. Arthur Johnson of that corporation called at St. Francis House, now the monastery guest house, to see this first memorial of Mrs. Gardner. They professed to be delighted with it. So we end where we began, standing in the lobby of the guest house monastery, gazing upon the photograph of a fashionably dressed, wasp-waisted, bejeweled woman, reading a green marble plaque in pious memory of Isabella Stewart Gardner, and to request that on the 14th of April in each year that the trustees shall have a memorial service conducted by the Society of St. John the Evangelist, otherwise known as the Cowley Fathers, in the chapel at the end of the long gallery in the building occupied by the museum established under this will. And it all begins to make sense, as does Father Burton's declaration that many generations of religious will venerate your memory as a foundress of their monastery and will pray for you as their generous benefactress. And so each year on Mrs. Gardner's birthday, the 14th of April, members of the society, along with some friends, members of the museum staff, and a few members of Mrs. Gardner's family gather in the chapel at the end of the long gallery to give thanks for the life and generosity of Isabella Stewart Gardner, mother foundress and generous benefactress of our monastery and of the Society of St. John the Evangelist.